I've always prided myself on being the guy who knows things. The guy with the answers, the quips, the uncanny ability to pick the winning horse, figuratively, of course. My wife, Laura, says I'm like a walking episode of Jeopardy! With bad jokes sprinkled in for flavor. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the text that buzzed into my life at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Monday night.
Now, let me set the scene for you. I was sprawled out on the couch in my usual glory, old college t-shirt, a glass of bourbon in one hand, and a crime drama on the TV that I wasn't really paying attention to. Life was good, comfortable. Then my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. Your wife's playing a game. If you want answers, visit the Red Room. Let's be real for a second. This wasn't your typical spam message about winning a Caribbean cruise. It had that unsettling edge, like a whisper in a horror movie just before the first murder. My initial reaction? I laughed. Loudly. Who writes stuff like this? Was it a prank? A joke? Had my buddy Eric had one too many martinis and decided to spice up my evening? But then, curiosity sank its claws in. I stared at those words, Red Room, letting them roll around in my brain. It felt like a dare, one of those you know you shouldn't but you will anyway kind of things. I leaned back and considered my options. 1. I could ignore the message, chalk it up to some bored internet troll, and finish my bourbon in peace. Or 2. I could dive into the rabbit hole and see where it led. Spoiler alert, I chose the rabbit hole. Why? Well, first, I'm a sucker for a good mystery. Second, Laura and I were in a good place, or so I thought. She was her usual radiant self, all red lips and sparkling laughter, the kind of woman who could turn heads even in a room full of supermodels. She'd never complained about me not paying enough attention to her or spending too much time at work. And yet, there was a part of me, a small, nagging voice, that whispered, what if? I grabbed my laptop and Googled Red Room, half expecting to find some sketchy nightclub or an art exhibit featuring abstract paintings of tomatoes. Instead, I landed on a page about an exclusive, members-only lounge in the heart of downtown. A place where secrets were currency, and anonymity was part of the allure. The club's tagline caught my eye, what you seek will find you here. I chuckled. Dramatic much? But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued. After all, whoever sent that message knew something I didn't. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's not being in on the joke. By morning, I convinced myself it was worth checking out. Worst case scenario, I'd waste an evening at a pretentious club with overpriced drinks. Best case? Well, I wasn't sure yet. What I did know was that this message was the first crack in the glass of what I thought was my perfect life. I just didn't realize yet how deep those cracks would run.
If I'm being honest, I thought the Red Room was going to be some swanky lounge with dim lighting, overpriced martinis, and a playlist full of soft jazz. The kind of place where people pretend they're having deep intellectual conversations while subtly checking their reflection in their glass. What I walked into? A completely different animal. The entrance itself was a clue that I was about to step into a world I probably wasn't ready for. Hidden in an alleyway between a vegan bakery and what I think was a psychic shop, the doorway was painted a deep crimson with no sign or handle, just a small brass buzzer. I pressed it, half expecting to be greeted by someone wearing a velvet smoking jacket and offering me a cigar. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a man in all black, tailored suit, slicked back hair, and sunglasses indoors, because of course. He gave me a once-over, like he was mentally scanning me for hidden weapons or, worse, a sense of decency.
First time?
He asked, his voice smooth but vaguely threatening. I nodded, trying to keep my usual sarcasm in check. Figured I'd check out the Yelp reviews. He didn't laugh. Instead, he stepped aside and motioned me in, and that's when I realized I had vastly underestimated this place. The first thing that hit me was the music, a low, throbbing bass line that seemed to sync up with my pulse, making it impossible not to feel just a little unsteady. The second thing? The smell. It was an overwhelming mix of expensive perfume, sweat, and something distinctly herbal. And then there were the people. Picture this, a sprawling room draped in red velvet, with chandeliers casting a dim, golden glow over the crowd. Couples lounged on oversized sofas, some sipping cocktails, others, well, let's just say they were enjoying each other's company in ways that would make my grandmother clutch her pearls. To one side, there was a bar with a bartender who looked like he'd just stepped off a runway, pouring drinks that sparkled like liquid jewels. On the other side? A dance floor pulsing with bodies, some swaying to the music, others so tangled up it was hard to tell where one person ended and another began. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't just a club. It was a playground for adults who had clearly decided the rules didn't apply to them. Drinks were flowing freely, of course, but so were other substances, neatly arranged lines on mirrored trays, discreetly passed capsules glowing in the red light. And the conversations? Oh, they were whispered behind hands, punctuated by laughter that was either entirely too loud or just on the edge of sinister. And then there were the rooms. Small, curtained-off areas where couples, and sometimes more than couples, slipped away for what I can only assume were activities best left off their tax returns. To say I was out of my element would be an understatement. Don't get me wrong, I'm no prude. I've been to my fair share of wild parties, and Laura? She's always been the life of the room, dancing on tables, charming strangers, somehow making chaos look glamorous. But this was chaos turned up to 11. As I wandered through the room, my head spinning from the sheer sensory overload, I couldn't stop thinking about her. My Laura. The woman who could talk her way out of a parking ticket and into a VIP section without breaking a sweat. She loved attention, sure. Loved the thrill of a night out. But this was a whole new level. I found myself at the bar, ordering something strong to steady my nerves. As the bartender slid me a glass of whiskey, I turned to look at the crowd again, trying to picture her here. Could she really be part of this? The thought made my stomach churn. This wasn't just about letting loose or having fun. This was a world of no boundaries, no limits, a place where people came to forget who they were, to lose themselves completely. And yet, the nagging voice in my head whispered, what if she's not just here? What if she belongs here? I drained my glass and tried to shake the thought. No, not Laura. Sure, she loved excitement, but this was insanity. But as I moved through the room, my eyes scanning faces and my mind replaying that damn text message, I couldn't help but feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to step back or jump.
First time?
It wasn't long before I noticed that everyone in the red room seemed to be orbiting around one particular area. It was tucked into a corner, partially obscured by crimson drapes and guarded by the same too cool for you energy as the doorman outside. Naturally, I had to see what the fuss was about. As I got closer, the heavy velvet curtain parted just enough for me to catch a glimpse inside. A wall, no, an entire shrine, covered in paper notes. They were pinned, taped, and even scrawled directly on the walls in ink that bled under the dim red lights. It was like someone had ripped out the pages of 1,000 diaries and decided to make an art installation. A sign above it read, in elegant gold script, "Confession is liberation." Because, of course, it does. The room was quieter than the rest of the club, filled with the kind of hushed reverence you'd expect in a church, if churches were full of half-dressed people with cocktails. A few men and women lingered around the wall, some reading, others writing their own secrets on small slips of parchment provided by the club. I hovered at the edge for a moment, wondering if this was really worth my time. Then I caught sight of a familiar scrawl, and my heart stopped. Her handwriting. I'd know it anywhere, looping, deliberate, the kind of script that made grocery lists look like poetry. Laura's. I stepped closer, trying to ignore the sudden pounding in my chest. There it was, pinned halfway up the wall on an elegant piece of cream-colored stationery. The words were like a sucker punch.
He's everything my husband isn't: reckless, wild, unpredictable. But it's just a game, right? Just a way to feel alive again.
My stomach turned. For a second, I thought I might actually throw up, right here in the middle of this carnival of debauchery. My eyes scanned the note again, hoping, praying I was wrong. But there was no mistaking it. This wasn't a stranger's confession. It was hers. The words burned themselves into my brain. Reckless. Wild. Unpredictable. Was that really what she thought of me? That I was too safe, too boring? The thought made my blood boil. I'm not saying I'm perfect. Hell, I've got flaws like anyone else. But I've spent the last 10 years being steady, reliable, the guy she could count on. And apparently, that wasn't enough. I wanted to rip the note off the wall and march out of there, but something stopped me. Instead, I found myself standing there, staring at it, dissecting every word. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung, it was the casualness of it all. Like I was some placeholder in her life, the safety net she kept while she went off chasing thrills.
A man next to me chuckled softly, pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. He was tall, with the kind of tailored suit that screamed money and a smirk that made me want to punch him.
First time here?
He asked, nodding toward the wall. Yeah, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. And apparently, I'm the last to know it exists. He laughed, a low, knowing sound.
Happens to the best of us. Sometimes you think you know someone, and then you read their soul stapled to a wall.
I shot him a look. Not exactly comforting. He shrugged.
Maybe not. But think of it this way. At least you're in the game now. Most people never even make it to the first round.
The game. That's what Laura called it too. Like this whole thing was just some twisted sport. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned back to the wall, scanning it for more. And that's when I saw it. Another note, this one less poetic but just as damning.
Wednesday nights are my favorite. That's when I meet him in the gold room upstairs. He says I'm his secret, but sometimes I wish I wasn't.
Gold room. Upstairs. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing it here wouldn't solve anything. I needed answers, not chaos. I took a deep breath, turned on my heel, and headed for the staircase at the back of the club. If she wanted to play games, fine. But she was about to find out that I play to win. The folder landed on my desk with a weight that felt far heavier than its modest size should have allowed. The detective, a wiry man with a grimace permanently etched into his face, slid it toward me without a word. His silence said enough.
Go ahead,
he muttered, his voice as dry as the leather jacket he wore.
You paid for the truth. Might as well see it.
I nodded, my jaw tight as I flipped the folder open. The first photograph hit me like a gut punch. There she was, Laura, my Laura, tangled with him. Alex. The personal trainer I'd seen a few times at the gym, the guy who always had a cocky grin and an arm flexed just a little too casually around the elliptical. It was a private room, dimly lit, with shadows playing across the walls. But the figures were unmistakable. Laura's flawless skin glistened under the muted light, her hair falling in waves as she leaned into him, her body curved and pressed against his. His hands were on her waist, gripping her as if she were something he had a right to. I stared, unable to tear my eyes away despite the bile rising in my throat. The second photo was worse. Her back arched, his lips on her neck. A sheet clung to her hips but left little to the imagination. Their limbs intertwined in a way that left no doubt about what had happened, or what was happening. By the third photo, it wasn't just disgust, it was rage. The way his hand rested on her thigh, the way her lips parted in a smile that I'd thought was mine and mine alone. Every detail clawed at me, each second of staring turning my stomach further.
You good?
The detective asked, his tone implying he didn't much care. I closed the folder sharply and leaned back, forcing myself to breathe. The anger surged hot and fierce, but I held it in check. I'd always been good at keeping my composure, and now wasn't the time to lose it. "I'm fine," I said, my voice calm, controlled, like a blade honed to a fine edge. "Thanks for your work." The detective shrugged.
Your call on what to do next. Just don't shoot anybody. I hate testifying.
With that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone with the evidence of my wife's betrayal. I stared at the folder, its edges sharp against the polished wood of my desk. The images were burned into my mind now, playing on a loop, each one a knife twisting deeper into my chest. But here's the thing, I didn't despair. I didn't crumble or drown myself in self-pity. That's not who I am. Laura wasn't just my wife, she was mine. She was my partner, my match, the woman I'd built my life around. And if she thought this was going to break me, if she thought I'd just walk away and let her slip into some other man's arms without a fight, she didn't know me as well as I thought. This wasn't over. I loved her. God, did I love her? Even now, even after everything. That love wasn't soft or gentle, it was fierce, unyielding, the kind that doesn't just fade because things get hard. I didn't care how tangled up in Alex she'd gotten. Whatever hold he had on her, I'd break it. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, letting the burn settle the storm inside me. I wasn't going to rush into this like some wounded puppy. No, this required precision, strategy. If Alex thought he'd won, if Laura thought she could keep playing this game without consequence, they were in for a rude awakening. Mine, I muttered to the empty room, the word laced with conviction. Because that's what she was. Mine to love, mine to protect, mine to pull back from the brink. This wasn't just about her betrayal, it was about reclaiming what was ours. I didn't know exactly how I was going to handle it yet. But one thing was certain, this wasn't the end of us. Not by a long shot. The thing about betrayal is that it's never simple. It's a labyrinth, every twist and turn revealing something darker, something deeper. Most men, I suppose, would have been consumed by rage or heartbreak at this point. Not me. Maybe I'm wired differently, but instead of letting Laura's affair crush me, it ignited something else entirely, a hunger to understand. Why? That's the question that gripped me. Why Alex? Why risk everything, our marriage, our life, for a man so unremarkable he probably has a love sign hanging in his apartment? It didn't add up, and I wasn't about to let this story play out without figuring out every detail. So, I decided to dive headfirst into the chaos. I had already copied Laura's phone earlier, using a simple software tool I'd bought on a whim months ago after watching too many spy movies. It was supposed to be a joke, a what-if kind of gadget, but now it felt like the smartest impulse buy I'd ever made. That evening, I poured another whiskey, sat in my study, and opened the app. A flood of messages popped up on my laptop screen. Texts. Photos. Voice memos. Everything. I took a deep breath and clicked on Alex's contact. The first messages were tame, almost laughable. Typical flirting, "You looked incredible today," or "I can't stop thinking about last night." Harmless, right? But as I scrolled, things took a sharper turn. Laura writes,
You make me feel alive again. Like the world isn't just schedules and obligations.
Alex writes,
You deserve to feel that way every day. Let me show you how much you matter.
My jaw tightened. Was this guy trying to steal lines from a bad romance novel? But Laura's replies told a different story. She was buying into it, hook, line, and sinker. Laura writes,
I love how reckless you are. Jack's amazing, but he's always so predictable.
Alex writes,
Predictable? I bet he never did this.
Attached was a photo. I didn't need to open it to know it would make my blood boil, so I moved on. The messages only got bolder. Laura writes,
I can't stop thinking about your hands on me last night. The way you made me feel, God, it's addictive.
Alex writes,
You've got me hooked too, baby. Tell me what you're wearing right now.
I paused, the words blurring on the screen. My mind spun. Laura wasn't just testing boundaries, she was smashing through them with reckless abandon. And yet, as much as it stung, it didn't kill my curiosity. If anything, it made me want answers more. What was she chasing? Thrills? Power? A sense of freedom? Or was it something deeper, something I'd failed to see? I kept scrolling, determined to piece it together. Buried among the heat and adrenaline of their exchanges were tiny glimpses of something more vulnerable. Laura writes,
Sometimes I feel like I've forgotten who I am. Like I'm not the girl I used to be.
Alex writes,
You are that girl. Let me remind you.
That stopped me cold. Forgotten who she was. What did that even mean? Laura was the most confident, vibrant person I knew. Or so I thought. I closed the laptop and leaned back, the whiskey burning in my chest. Laura's betrayal wasn't just about Alex. It wasn't even about me. This was about her, something she felt she'd lost, something she was chasing with a desperation I hadn't seen before. The realization didn't make it hurt any less, but it gave me clarity. She wasn't looking for love, she was looking for herself. And while I hated Alex for worming his way into her head, I couldn't deny a part of me was fascinated by this side of her, the side that had been hidden, even from me. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. If Laura thought she could have this adventure without me, she was dead wrong. This was my story too, and I wasn't about to sit on the sidelines. I stood, my resolve solidifying like steel. The spark of curiosity had become a flame, and I was going to burn through every lie, every secret, until I got the truth. If Laura wanted to play games, I'd play. But I wasn't going to lose. By now, I was neck deep in Laura's secret world, and I wasn't just floating, I was swimming with purpose. Her messages, the photos, the confessions, they weren't just clues, they were invitations to something raw and dangerous. If she wanted to live on the edge, then so be it. I'd meet her there. I decided to confront Alex first. Not because I needed him to explain himself, but because I wanted to see the man she thought was worth risking everything for. The guy who had somehow convinced my wife that he was an upgrade from me. Finding him wasn't hard. A quick Google search, some casual observation at the gym, and a strategically timed conversation with the front desk gave me everything I needed. Alex had a routine, and it wasn't exactly complex: train hard, flirt harder, and apparently, make time for illicit rendezvous with other men's wives. I followed him one evening to a bar on the other side of town. It wasn't the kind of place Laura and I frequented, too loud, too gritty, the kind of spot where the drinks were cheap and the company cheaper. He was at the bar, laughing with a group of people who looked just as hollow and smug as he did. I walked up, calm and confident, and slid onto the stool next to him. "Alex," I said, my voice low but deliberate. He turned, his grin faltering just slightly when he saw me.
"Do I know you?"
"You should. I'm Jack." I paused, letting the weight of my name sink in. Laura's husband. The color drained from his face, but he recovered quickly, plastering on that same cocky smirk I'd seen in his photos.
"Ah, Jack. I've heard a lot about you."
"I'll bet," I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. I leaned in just enough to make him squirm. "You've got a lot of nerve, Alex. I'll give you that. But let's get one thing straight, you're playing in my sandbox, and I don't share my toys." He blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. I didn't give him the chance. "See, I get it," I continued. "Laura's beautiful, charming, a little dangerous. She's the kind of woman who can make you feel like you're the only man in the world. But let me tell you something, you're not. You're a phase. A distraction. And when she's done with you, you'll be nothing but a footnote in her story." Alex shifted uncomfortably, his bravado cracking under the weight of my words.
"Look, man, I don't want any trouble."
"Then stay away from my wife," I said, cutting him off. "Because the next time I see you, I won't be in such a good mood. I stood, tossing a few bills onto the bar, and walked out without looking back. But confronting Alex was only part of the equation. The real challenge was Laura. That night, I waited for her to come home, sitting in the dark like some cliché private investigator. When the door finally opened, and she walked in, I could see the surprise on her face when she spotted me.
Jack?
She said, setting her bag down.
You're up late.
Couldn't sleep, I replied, my tone even. Thought we should talk. She hesitated, clearly sensing that something was off.
About what?
She hesitated, clearly sensing that something was off. About what? I stood, crossing the room to face her. About you. About Alex. About why my wife, my smart, beautiful, seemingly happy wife, decided to light a match and set our marriage on fire. Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face.
Jack,
Save it, I said, holding up a hand. I've seen the photos. I've read the messages. I know everything. For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Finally, she sank into the nearest chair, her shoulders slumping.
I didn't mean for this to happen.
She said, her voice barely above a whisper.
I never wanted to hurt you.
Well, congratulations, I said, my tone sharp but controlled. Because you did. But here's the thing, Laura, I'm not going anywhere. You're mine, and I don't give up that easily. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears.
Jack,
No, I interrupted. I'm talking now. You wanted adventure? Fine. But I'm going to remind you why you married me in the first place. And when I'm done, Alex will be nothing but a bad memory. She didn't respond, but I could see the flicker of something in her expression, hope, fear, maybe even a spark of the woman I'd fallen in love with. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Laura wanted a game? I'd show her how it's played. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope, with every step a careful balance between control and chaos. Laura didn't deny it anymore. She didn't try to lie or justify herself. Instead, she simply watched me with that guarded look in her eyes, as if waiting for the hammer to fall. But I didn't lose my cool. I didn't rage, pack a bag, or throw her out of the house. That wasn't my style. Instead, I leaned into the storm, determined to figure out not only why this happened but how we could move forward, if we could move forward. We talked. A lot. Late nights on the couch, Laura with a glass of wine, me with my usual whiskey. She opened up in bits and pieces, like chipping away at a block of ice. She told me how she felt stuck in a routine, how she craved something unpredictable. She told me how Alex made her feel alive, how the thrill of sneaking around gave her a rush she hadn't felt in years. But she also told me how much she loved me. How guilty she felt every time she looked at me, knowing she was betraying the man who had stood by her through everything. How, even now, she wasn't sure what she wanted or what she deserved. And me? I listened. I let her words wash over me, each one a knife that cut deep but also cleared the fog. I didn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I didn't leave her either. Instead, I planned something. A week after our big confrontation, I told her to pack a bag. No explanations, no hints. Just a simple command, we're leaving. We drove for hours, out of the city and into the mountains, where the air was crisp and the noise of our complicated lives felt a million miles away. I'd booked a cabin, just the two of us, no distractions, no Alex lurking in the shadows. The first day was awkward. We danced around each other, careful with our words, careful with our silence. But by the second day, something shifted. We hiked, we cooked together, we laughed, real laughter, the kind we hadn't shared in years. And for a brief moment, it felt like we were finding our way back to each other. But the shadows of what she'd done were always there, lingering at the edge of every smile, every touch. On our last night in the cabin, As we sat by the fire, I looked at her, really looked at her. She was still the woman I'd fallen in love with. Still the woman I wanted to fight for, even if it meant fighting through hell. Laura, I said, my voice steady, I need to know. Was he worth it? She didn't look away. Her eyes met mine, full of regret and something that looked like hope.
No.
She said quietly.
He was never worth losing you.
I nodded, letting her words sink in. They felt real, but trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. The next morning, we packed up and drove home, the silence between us less heavy but still thick with questions. And now, here we are. You've heard my story, the betrayal, the anger, the fight to understand. And now I'm standing at a crossroads. What do I do? Do I keep fighting for her, for us, knowing that it will take time and pain to rebuild what's been broken? Or do I cut my losses and walk away, knowing that no matter what, the scars of this will stay with me forever? I'm asking you, dear reader. If you were in my shoes, if you were staring at the woman you loved and the ashes of the life you built together, what would you do? Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.